Hi folks! Tonight I'm going to once again go out of order in Millay's 1921 volume 2nd April. This time I'm reading you Song of 2nd April, which is arguably the poem from which the collection takes its name. It has a special seasonal significance as well, which I'll tell you about once I read you the poem. So let's get started with that. Song of a 2nd April by Edna St. Vincent Millay. April this year, not otherwise than April of a year ago, is full of whispers, full of sighs, of dazzling mud and dingy snow. Hepaticas that pleased you so are here again, and butterflies. The rings a-hammering all day, and shingles lie about the doors. In orchards near and far away, the gray woodpecker taps and bores. The men are merry at their chores, and children earnest at their play. The larger streams run still and deep, noisy and swift the small brooks run. Among the mullein stalks the sheep go up the hillside in the sun. Pensively, only you are gone, you that alone I cared to keep. All right, so that was Song of a 2nd April from 2nd April. So the seasonal significance of this poem is that, at least in my part of the world, the hepaticas are in bloom, and earlier this week I went to photograph them in a local conservation area. If you're particularly interested in seeing what they look like, I'll post a link to my iNaturalist observation in the description below. But if you're less familiar, you may be asking yourself, what is a hepatica? So hepatica is the name for several species of flowers in the Ranunculaceae family, which is the buttercup family. They all feature 6 petals, making them a monocot, 3 flower bracts, a hairy stem, and a trilobal leaf. That trilobal leaf is how they got the name hepatica, as well as the other common names liverleaf or liverwort, because someone, presumably someone who had never actually seen a human liver, thought it resembled one. Under the doctrine of signatures, which holds that like treats like, they were used to treat liver disorders in early herbalism. The flowers themselves can be purple, pink, blue, or white, and are generally very small, no more than 1 inch across and only about 2 to 3 inches off the ground. Here, Millay is probably talking about the flower called the blunt or round-lobed hepatica, which is native to the eastern U.S. If you're wondering why I haven't given you a scientific name yet, well, it's because there's a lot of debate about that. To cut a long botanical story short, this plant can variously be called Anemone americana, Hepatica americana, or Hepatica nobilis var. Obtusa. So it's a question of whether or not it's considered to be its own genus or part of the anemone genus, and whether or not it is its own species or part of the Hepatica nobilis, which is the European hepatica. Either way, hepaticas are what are often referred to as a spring ephemeral. These are flowers that bloom for a short period in spring before trees come into leaves, aiming to complete their entire life cycle before the forest floor loses most of its light. Other examples of ephemerals you may have heard of are trilliums or spring beauties. Some of the other fauna and flora mentioned in the poem speak of April as well. Butterflies are just beginning to be seen here in New England. In fact, I captured a picture of a spring azure when I was looking for hepaticas. Woodpeckers seem to be especially active at this time of the year too, or at the very least, without the trees in leaf, they're easier to notice. I've noticed a lot of tapping and calls of the pileated woodpecker lately in the woods behind my house. In that way, you can say that the genre of this poem is that thumbnail sketch of nature that I talked about when we discussed the poem Assault. But it's more than that, really. In my first Millay video, I discussed the recurrent theme in this book, 2nd April, of nostalgia and this sense of returning to a familiar place where something crucial has changed. The first 2 lines of this poem definitely echo that. April this year, not otherwise of April of a year ago. It then goes on to list all the things that are the same as last year, before ending with, pensively, only you are gone, you that alone I cared to keep. Assuming this is biographical, who is the person that so defines the before and after of this poem, and indeed the entire volume? It's hard to pin down because I can't find a record of when this particular poem was written or first published. And in Millay's early life, she had a number of lovers this could have been about. This, of course, is assuming we're discussing an absence due to a fractured relationship rather than due to death or other loss. But I think that's the safest assumption here, especially since it would be several years before Millay lost anyone that she held dear due to death. But after going through a bunch of dead ends, and that's why this is late, my theory is that the poem was written to Arthur Hooley, an Englishman, writer, and editor that Millay met in May of 1913 at the home of her editor in Mamoroneck, New York. I'm almost certainly pronouncing that wrong, and I have literally no excuse, because it's near Vassar, where I went to college. And she carried on a flirtation with Hooley until 1917. Well, they may have had some romantic interludes in person. Much of their contact was via letter, and it's clear from these letters that Millay loved Hooley way more than he loved her, and that he was always trying to evade her and give her the brush off in various ways. He passed out of her life in 1917 with little fanfare, after sending her a bunch of letters refusing to meet with her, often with the excuse that he was dying and had to return to England. Most biographies of Millay omit mention of Hooley because it was unclear for a long time who a certain Charles Vale was, a pen name Hooley used for his writing and editing work, and also how the letters to and from Millay were addressed. Inside the envelopes, the letters were signed Arthur, which caused additional confusion with the later lover of Millay's, Arthur Davison Ficke, but Ficke wouldn't really come into her life in person for a few more years. But Hooley figures extensively in Daniel Mark Epstein's biography, What Lips My Lips Have Kissed, where he's an important presence in Millay's life during her years at Vassar, almost precisely, eventually teaching her the importance of not loving someone more than they love her. Not for long, I'd argue. She was never very sensible in romance. According to the Epstein biography, poems to Hooley are scattered throughout Millay's first 3 volumes, including 2nd April. As a reminder, this is her 2nd volume. The first was Renaissance and Other Poems. Moreover, other poems we know are about Hooley, reference the sights and sounds you might expect in springtime in Mamoroneck, New York. An example of this is 3 Songs of Shattering from Renaissance and Other Poems, which references plum blossoms, dogwood, things like that. The Epstein biography even says of Millay's attitude to the fracture with Hooley, she had too much humor to mourn too long that lost April. It's not entirely clear to me why he chooses the word April here, since he earlier had said that they met in May of 1913, but that phrase makes me suspect that Epstein suspects that Hooley's the person who turned Millay's Aprils upside down, and in general I find his biographical instincts pretty good. Finally, while many of the poems in 2nd April were originally published in 1919 or 1920, as we've seen, we also know some of them were published as early as 1913. So it's not inconceivable that this could have been written in 1917, when Millay would have been mourning the loss of her dyspeptic Englishman, as she would sometimes call him. That will put the date of the writing too late to go into Renaissance and Other Poems, which I think was finalized in 1917, but just right for her next volume. Also, fun to me fact, this is one of the poems of Millay's I memorized as a young teen. As ever, I did not recite this from memory tonight, in the interest of not tripping over my words or getting things wrong. But it holds a dear spot in my heart, as do hepaticas for that matter. Alright, we've run a bit long tonight. Turns out there was more to say here than I expected, but I hope you've enjoyed this increasingly less daily dose of Millay. Have a great night.